everyone. My name is Shalhevet Schwartz, and this is Gefet on Daf Yomi, a joint project of Hadran and Yeshivat Drisha. We are nearing we are really finishing up the Masechet at the very tail end of Masechet Avodah Zarah. And what we're going to be discussing today is the topic of the final sugyot of Masechet Avodah Zarah, and that is the topic of Tevilat Keilim, of the immersion that we need to do to new dishes or new vessels of other sorts, or not only new ones, but of vessels and dishes before they before Jews use them. And what we're going to see that this little sugya at the end maybe can give us kind of insights as we wrap up Masechet Avodah Zarah, a Masechet that's been that deals it really throughout with the relationships between Jews and Gentiles. What this practice of Tevilat Keilim can tell us about that relationship as well. So let's get started with the Mishnah. Right, the Mishnah begins with Halokech kli tashmish min ha'odei kochavim. Right, someone who purchases a kind of usable vessel from a Gentile or from an idol worshiper. So lists three different actions that one might take depending on the kind of kli we're talking about. From the way that the Mishnah is formulating it, right? Depending on what you do with these dishes or with these vessels, that will affect what we do in order to ready them for use by a Jew. So that which it is the way that it's used is dunking in water, right? Those right? The things that are that typically are immersed, one would immerse. That typically are hagala is what we often think of as koshering, because that's what we do with lots of our dishes before Pesach. But hagala is immersing in boiling water. And labin ba'ur, that's the libun is kind of direct contact with fire, so blowtorching or that sort of thing, which is how one would kosher a pan or an oven or something like that. So we have three different actions here: hatbala, hagala, and libun. Hagala and libun we know are actions that are koshering, but hatbala for those used to toveling dishes when you buy them new, right? We'll see in a little bit that one tovels dishes even when we buy them new. So, but the way that the Mishnah presents these three different actions is that depending on the typical use of the vessel in question, that will affect the action that readies it for Jewish use. Now, the Gemara comes along and points out that that's not quite the case, and halacha, obviously we pass that that's not quite the case. So, right, Tana, already we bring a brayta v'kulan tzrichin tvila ba'arba'im sa'ah. Right, all of them not require right all of the all of the things listed in the Mishnah before, not just everything requires tvila. So even the stuff that requires hagala and the stuff that requires libun also requires tvila. Minahan Mili, where does this come from? Amar Rava, and right, Rava brings a pasuk to demonstrate this. De Amar Kra kol davar asher yavo ba'ish ta'aviru ba'ish v'taher. So Rava brings a pasuk about the instructions that Bnei Yisrael receive after Milchamet Midian, right after fighting and defeating the Midianites. Then they're permitted to take some spoils, but they have to ready those spoils for use for Israelite use, right? And so this is where we get many of the principles of Hachsharat Kelim from. So those things that are Yavo Ba'ish, Tavir Ba'ish, right? Anything that typically goes through fire, so libun, send through fire, vitaher, right? And then at the end of the pasuk it says, right, and it will become cleansed or become purified. So Rava has a little diuk on this pasuk. Husif l'cha katuv tahara acheret. The word taher is kind of added on at the end, tacked on at the end, to show us like that there's an additional kind of tahara that the kli that the vessel needs to undergo, and that's how we know that even the things that require hagala and libun also require tvila. I'm going to skip to the bottom of Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rabba bar Avua. Rav Nachman says in the name of Rabba bar Avua that afilu kelim chadashim b'mashma. Tehai yeshanim v'libanan kechadashim damu. The afilu hachi by tavil. By tevila. I think there should be a hay at the end there. So right, even new dishes are kind of included in this, right? So not only dishes that you've koshered, but also new ones, right? Because right, old vessels that I let's say took from a Gentile who had used them for non-kosher things, but then I blowtorched them, so now they're kosher. They're as though they're new, according to says Rabba bar Avua, and we know that those Rava just told us require tefillah. So if they're like they're new and they require tefillah, then even chadashim, even kelim chadashim, even new vessels require tefillah. All right. So right from this Gemara, right, we can tell already that tefillah is has a slightly different nature than the other forms of hachshara kelim that we saw hagala and libun. But the question is going to be, okay, so then what is the particular role that tefillah plays? We know that hachshara on some level is meant to get out the kind of the remains of whatever non-kosher food has been cooked in these vessels, whether that's ta'am, whether that's mamash. But then if that's the case, then and it's not totally clear what the role of tevilah is. And so we're going to the Rishonim are going to take a couple of different stabs at what exactly tevilah is all about. And we're going to actually see how that plays out through a machloket, through a halachic machloket about actually the order, whether the order matters of tevilah and hagalah. So we're going to start with Tosafot. Right, and Tosafot tells us lav davka magil v'achar kach yetbil. He's on a dibur matil about of a breita that says that kelim, even old kelim that you've used, magilan umatbilan, right? That you're supposed to do hagala and tevilah. And Tosafot saying lav davka hagala first and then tevilah. It doesn't necessarily have to happen in that order. Ella afilu matbil beresha. Rather, even if you told it first, that's fine. Right? Why is that the case according to Tosafot? They have to be that inami feel tuma. Do they have a ketova b'sheret biyado? Right? Why might I have thought? Let's start there. Why might I have thought that the order does matter? Why might I have thought that I wouldn't be able to tovel a dish or a vessel that was still treif and it still had treif food in it? In general, we know that. Right, let's say a person who goes to the mikvah in order to become who was tameh from too much sheretz or something. We know in general that the process of tevilah comes to litaher a person, right? A person who was tameh, had some kind of tum'ah, goes through a process of tahara that ends in tevilah. But let's say I became tameh through too much sheretz. I can't now go to the mikvah and try to become impure if I'm holding on to the sheretz. It doesn't work. So I might have thought, right, if on some level what the tevilah is trying to do is serve as some kind of purification process, of the dish, right, of the vessel. But if the vessel is still impure, meaning it still has treif food kind of cooked into it, then it would be tevilah, right, tovel b'sheretz biyado. So Tosafot says, no, don't think it's like that. The order doesn't matter, right? Why is that? Because look, like even vessels that have never had anything impure in them at all require tevilah. So this kind of tevilat keilim, must be of a totally different nature, and must actually not be connected really to iser v'heter at all. It must not be connected to the tuma that's in the keilim, aka the treif food that's in the keilim at all. So that's one proof that chadashim from tevilah. He's going to bring another proof. Utna nami sakin shafa v'hi tahora. Right, when it comes to koshering knives, if I want to kosher it for use with cold things, I don't necessarily need to do hagala. I can just do a kind of an easier process that just requires kind of rubbing it down, and that permits it for use with cold things, right? Even though that doesn't actually purify it, right? There still might be treif food balua in it. Shehari tzricha gi'ul laftoch orteach, right? It would still require hagala in order to use it for hot things. Afilu hafi matbil laftoch batzone, right? Um, if you just do this process of right, this less intensive process that doesn't entirely um, remove all the trait from it. You can tovel it and use it for cold food. But again, if we required hagala, if we required the vessel to be entirely pure before we did tevila, then that wouldn't make any sense because here the vessel is not entirely pure and you can do tevila and use it for cold things. So those are the two proofs, hadashim and the and after just comes to note of earlier, right? He said lav davka hagala first, and then hatbala, and then tevila. But then he has to contend with the fact that the brayta is phrased as matbilan, matbilan, right? One immerses in hot water and then immerses in cold water. The hadatane, the brayta, magilan bereisha. The reason why the brayta says hagala first, mishum de chamira mipnei ha'isur, is just because hagala is a kind of more stringent or more significant action because it actually gets rid of the isur itself, right? It's almost more important that you do hagala than that you do tefillah because if you don't do hagala and then you eat the food is like mamish tray. All right. So just the Tosafot's mahalach here, right? Tosafot's halachic claim is that one can do tefillah before hagala. What's the reason? That tefillah doesn't really have to do with Isser V'Heter. It doesn't have to do with the tray food that has been balua inside the kelim. What's Tosafot's proof? Tosafot has two proofs. We total new dishes and we total knives, even though the knife hasn't undergone proper hafshara. And right, what's his how does he textually deal with the fact that the Braita says hagala first? The Braita mentions hagala before tefillah only because it's like more significant or more important. Now, the Tur in Yordea quotes the Rashba, who is cholek on Tosafot, right? Who disagrees with Tosafot, and maybe gives us a slightly different picture of what he thinks Haggadah is all about. Tosafot says it's not about Isser V'Heter. He doesn't exactly say what it is about, but the Rashba says something different. Katav Rashba davka magilan v'achar kaf matbilan. Right, you have to do Haggadah first. About imi tbilan tefillah. Habi ketova v'sheretz biyado. Right, if you do tevila before you do hagala, and the tray food is still kind of inside the vessel, right? Then it's like tova b'sheretz biyado. How could it be that tevila, on some level, it seems like the Rashba, right, thinking like the Hava of Tosafot is thinking that tevila for kelim works more or less like tevila for people. Right, that on some level, right, when we contract a certain kind of impurity, we have to get rid of the impurity, and then as the end of that process of kind of moving from the state of impurity to the state of purity, we immerse in water. So too with with vessels, right? They go from a state of pure impurity to a state of purity, right? We get the bad food out. And then as a kind of an end of that process, it undergoes tefillah. And then he quotes the Ri, who has the same opinion as Tosafot. So just to take a look at the machloket here, right? The halacha, according to Tosafot, one can tovel before hagala, and according to the Rashba, one cannot. What's the reason? According to Tosafot, we don't really know what the reason is. We just know that tefillah doesn't have to do with Isser V'Heter, whereas according to the Rashba, tefillah is part of the process of hafshara, right? It's the end of that process of hafshara, which begins with hagala to remove the non-kosher remains, and then it ends with this kind of transitional moment. And right, textually, right, according to Tosafot, Braita mentions hagala first just because it's more significant, whereas according to the Rashba, right, the Braita is written dafka, right? Magilan umatbilan, right? One does hagala first and then tefillah. As for really kind of what's behind this machloket and what for both the shita of Tosafot and the shita of the Rashba, what really is behind Tevilat Keilim in the first place, right? I think a couple of other later Rishonim can give us a little bit more of a window into the, I guess, kind of spiritual or theological significance of Tevilat Keilim according to each of those shitot. So the Meiri, right, he takes the Rashba's direction, right? He thinks that the order does matter, and he gives us a little bit more language, I think, for what it means for Tevilah to be the end of the process of the end of the process of hafshara. Tevilah zo. מכיוון שעיקרה לכניסת קדושת מאכלות אינה בכלים ישנים אלא אחר שהות כשירים. Right, this tefillah, because it's fundamentally about knisat kedushat ma'achalot, right, bringing bringing the sanctity of the sanctity of food, right? Preparing the kelim for kedushat machalot, right? For for sanctified foods, right? It's about preparing this vessel for eating kosher food, right? At one point, the vessel was its job was holding non-kosher food, and now it's holding kosher food. But kosher also in the sense of sanctified, right? And we're preparing the vessels for sanctity. They can't become sanctified, again, just like people, they can't become sanctified without first being rid of all of the kind of impurities that have been inside of them. Right? Right? If you tovel them before you kosher them, how can they become holy? Right? They're not yet actually prepared for kedusha. Right? Again, using that language of tovel b'sharetz biado, as though you're immersing in the mikveh, holding your kind of impure animal. So again, according to the Tevilat Keilim is a way of preparing the vessels for sanctity, for use with pure or permitted food, and can only kind of get to that state of sanctity when they're rid of all of the non-kosher remains. On the other side, we see a really kind of fascinating description by the Marach or Zarua, the son of the Or Zarua that people that the more famous Or Zarua, who also kind of emerges from Ashkenaz, right, from this Shita of Balei Tosafot, and he quotes Yerushalmi. Yerushalmi mefarish mipnei shiatzu mitumat goyim v'nichnasu v'kedushat Yisrael. We're talking about toveling dishes that, right, these vessels have left the impurity of, right, Gentile impurity and have entered into kedushat Yisrael. They've entered into Israelite purity. And what's he going to compare it to? Midameh oto leger shenichnas lekedusha al yedei tevilah. It's like a convert who becomes sanctified via this tevilah. Right, even though the right even though yes, okay, even though before buying it, this is not so relevant, right? If a kli that, let's say, a new kli or a kosher kli that belongs to a Gentile, I can use it without toveling it. But if I buy it from the Gentile, then I have to tovel it, right? So on some level, right, it's about actually transition of ownership of these kelim is really, according to this Marach or Zarua, a form of conversion, right? Tevilat Keilim is a way of transitioning vessels from Gentile to Jewish ownership. And it's right, the kelim themselves are undergoing a process of conversion. It's totally separate from the Isser Beheter, from what treif food is balua, right, is inside the kelim or is not inside the kelim. The question is, are these Jewish kelim or are they Gentile kelim? And also when the moment of transition, right, the other people, right, Jews immerse in a mikvah when they go from a state of impurity to a state of purity, but there's another kind of tevilah that people undergo, and that's the tevilah of conversion. It's not necessarily about about finishing a process of transition from impurity to purity, but transition from being a Gentile to being a Jew. So too, right, these kelim are undergoing transition from Gentile ownership to Jewish ownership. So, right, what really is the essence of Tevilat Keilim? According to the Rashba, Tevilah is part of the process of Hakshara of the vessel from impure food. It's part of the world of Avodah. Right, just like people undergo Tevilah at the end of a process of purification, so too, right, so too do vessels. Whereas, according to the Morach or Zarua's, at least, understanding of Tosafot, Tevilah is part of this conversion process from the Gentile world to Jewish ownership. In some ways, it's the world of Tumah V'Tahara, but not the world of Tumah V'Tahara in the sense of Yoreh and getting out the treif food, but about Kedushat Yisrael, right, about entering into Kedushat Yisrael. So hopefully this, right, as we really wrap up this Masechet that deals a lot with the relationships between Jews and Gentiles, thinking also about how do we relate to the objects in our world, and right, are we thinking, right, when we think in terms of Jew and Gentile objects, are we thinking in terms of purity and impurity of, right, of the content of, right, are there is treif food really kind of, is treif food the impure thing that we need to kind of excise from these vessels when we acquire them, or is it really a sense that our objects and, right, the the fact that our objects are under Gentile ownership versus under Jewish ownership, there's significance to that, that's independent, and that our objects, almost like people themselves, can kind of undergo a process of conversion. Thank you so much, and see you next week.